Caspian thought he was the king of Paris Fashion Week, flaunting his mistress in the front row. But when the lights dimmed, the music stopped. His pregnant ex-wife didn't just walk out as a model. She walked out as the owner of his entire empire. Tonight, a billionaire becomes a beggar, and a mistress realizes she's been playing for the wrong team. Stay tuned, because the final twist, it's not just about money, it's about a bloodline he never saw coming. Welcome back to Heart-Woven Tales. I'm Selena, and I hope you're doing well today. I'm so glad you're here with me. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? I'd love to know. And while we're at it, how would you rate my stories out of 10? Don't skip ahead, okay? Make sure you watch till the very end, because every twist and turn matters. And of course, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. All right, let's dive in. The heel of Caspian Thorne's shoe scraped marble as he stepped forward, the sound sharp and deliberate, the kind meant to announce ownership before a word was spoken. Cameras snapped instantly. The air inside the Grand Palais felt warm, thick with perfume, hot lights, and the low buzz of money talking to money. Caspian didn't slow down. He never did. "Smile," he muttered without looking sideways, and Sia laughed anyway, light and rehearsed, her fingers tightening around his arm. Diamonds spilled over her collarbone, familiar stones, old stones, Thorne family stones, as she tilted her head to catch the light. "Everyone's staring," she whispered, thrilled. "They always do," Caspian said. He adjusted his cufflinks while walking, the small habit grounding him, thumb rubbing the engraved T as if it were a pulse. The first row came into view, front and center, his seat, his territory. He sat before the applause even finished, crossing one leg over the other, spreading himself comfortably. Sia slid in beside him, her dress whispering when she moved. She leaned close. "This place smells expensive." "It is," Caspian said. "I paid for it." He scanned the row, eyes landing on the empty chair to his right. Still empty. He smiled, slow and amused. "Huh," he said. "The mysterious owner still hiding." Sia followed his gaze. "Owner?" "Anonymous buyer," Caspian replied. "Bought the venue last quarter. No one's met them." She giggled. "Probably some shy billionaire. Or someone who knows better than to sit next to me," he said lightly. Around them, heads turned, not toward him but away. Whispers rippled, subtle and restrained. Caspian mistook it for awe. He always did. A man 2 seats down leaned toward his wife. "That's her?" he murmured, nodding at Sia. The wife didn't answer, just pressed her lips together. Sia waved at someone she didn't recognize. They didn't wave back. "Rude crowd," she said. Caspian checked his watch. 10 minutes to showtime. Perfect. "You see the sponsor banner?" he asked. "Everywhere," Sia said. "Your name's huge." As if summoned, the massive screen above the runway flickered. The Vane Collection logo rolled across it, clean, elegant. Caspian nodded, satisfied, pulling his VIP badge from his jacket and letting it rest against his palm. Plastic, heavy, valid. Or so he thought. Behind them, a soft beep sounded near the entrance. No one noticed. Caspian leaned back, stretching his arms along the seat backs. "Front row," he said quietly. "Best seat in Europe tonight." Sia smiled, then lowered her voice. "Your ex would have loved this." His jaw tightened for half a second. "She wouldn't understand it," he said. "She never did." "I do," Sia said quickly. "I know," he replied. A photographer crouched in front of them. "Sir, one shot?" Caspian angled his chin. Sia leaned in. Flash. Another. Somewhere above, the lights shifted. One spotlight dimmed, then steadied. "Did the lights just—" Sia began. "They're testing," Caspian said. "Relax." A woman in a black blazer walked down the aisle, stopped 2 rows ahead, checked a tablet, frowned, then whispered to a man with an earpiece. He nodded once. Caspian noticed the movement. "Everything okay?" Sia asked. "Of course," he said. They're probably adjusting seating. The empty chair beside him remained empty. Minutes passed. The hum grew louder. Anticipation thickened. The smell of fabric, new and untouched, drifted from backstage. A man behind Caspian leaned forward. "Strange," he muttered. "What?" Caspian snapped, half turning. "Nothing," the man said quickly. Caspian exhaled through his nose, lifting his badge again and rolling it between his fingers. The plastic felt warmer now, slippery. Sia leaned over. "People are staring again." "Good," Caspian said, but this time he followed her gaze. Across the aisle, a group of executives stood, not sitting, watching. One caught Caspian's eye, then looked away. Caspian straightened, tapping his badge against the armrest. Tap, tap. The giant screen flickered again. The vain logo freezing for half a second before resuming, a low chime echoed. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice began, then cut off. Silence. The chime sounded again, sharper. "Is this part of the drama?" Sia laughed nervously. Caspian didn't answer. A security guard approached from the aisle, tall, broad-shouldered, neutral-faced. He stopped just short of Caspian and bent slightly. "Sir." "Yes," Caspian replied. The guard glanced at the badge, then at his earpiece. "There seems to be an issue." "With what?" "Your access." Sia's smile faltered. "Access?" Caspian chuckled. "You're mistaken. Sir, could you hand me your pass?" Caspian stared. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, sir, that's why I'm here." Caspian handed over the badge. The scanner beeped. Read, once, twice. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard said. "Your credit line for the event has been pulled. You are no longer listed as the sponsor." Sia's fingers slipped from Caspian's arm. "That's impossible," Caspian said. "Your access was revoked 6 minutes ago." 6 minutes. Caspian looked up at the screen. His name was still there, for now. "This is a mistake," he said. "Fix it." "Please remain seated," the guard replied as the lights dimmed another notch. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered his name, not with admiration, but curiosity. Have you ever watched someone realize, just for a second, that the floor under them might not be solid? The first note of the opening score trembled through the hall. Caspian Thorne, king of textiles, sat in the front row, holding nothing but an invalid pass and a smile that was starting to crack. And if stories like this make you lean closer without realizing it, you already know what to do. Subscribe, because this night has only just begun. The first note of music hung in the air, vibrating through Caspian's chest like a warning he refused to hear. He clenched his hands against the velvet armrests, knuckles white beneath the shine of his cufflinks. Sia leaned forward, her eyes wide, the diamonds on her dress catching flashes of the stage lights and refracting them like tiny alarms he was still too proud to read. The runway was empty for a heartbeat. Then a model appeared, moving with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Caspian leaned forward instinctively, expecting some mediocrity, something his name could still claim. But the moment the model's gown brushed the polished floor, his stomach sank. It wasn't silk his factories produced. It wasn't gold from his artisans. It was something new, something impossible in its perfection, draped and flowing, catching every spotlight in ways that made the diamonds on Sia seem cheap, almost vulgar. And then he saw it, the logo, a crest he hadn't seen in decades, tucked subtly in the embroidery, twisting light off its gold threads, the unmistakable crest of the Vance family. His heart thudded, fast, shallow, like a frightened animal caught in its own trap. Sia's hand went to her mouth, and her lips parted in disbelief. That's, she started, voice trembling, then faltered. Caspian's eyes flicked to her, a fleeting attempt at reassurance, but he couldn't speak, not yet. His brain was rewinding, flashing back to the sketches he kept in his private safe, the ones he had been so certain were his secrets, his control, his empire in miniature. Every seam, Every fold, every stitch he had hoarded and guarded for years, now paraded before him on the runway, transformed into something he hadn't dreamed possible. He felt his palms sweat, sliding against the armrest as if it could anchor him to reality, but reality had already left. The audience leaned forward collectively, the soft rustle of fabric, the stifled gasps and murmurs. A living wave of awe washing over him, and Caspian realized the impossible. This was not his show. This was not his victory. This was a public trial of his arrogance, staged in silk and gold, and he was the defendant. He stood instinctively, a reflex to assert dominance, to claim some fragment of control, but two massive men in suits materialized beside him as if from nowhere. Their hands pressed down firmly on his shoulders, a silent command, and he froze mid-motion. Caspian's breath hitched, the sound faint but tense, as if the air itself had thickened around him. He glanced around, noticing for the first time the eyes of the crowd, not admiration, not fear, not envy, but curiosity mingled with judgment. And there, just behind the velvet ropes, a few whispered, almost imperceptibly, "Did he steal this?" Caspian's stomach twisted. He tried to speak, to order the music stopped, to demand the models leave the runway, but words lodged in his throat. The men's hands remained firm, unwavering, a tactile reminder that power is only as real as the permission others grant it. Sia's pale face was inches from his, her hand hovering uncertainly, trembling as though she wanted to pull him back into some illusion of safety he no longer deserved. Another model glided onto the runway, the fabric catching every camera flash like liquid sunlight. Caspian could feel each shutter click in his chest, punctuating his panic with a rhythm that mocked him. Each design was more audacious than the last, more precise, more perfect. The cuts, the embroidery, the movement, it was all him, and yet not him. Someone had taken his ideas, his intellectual property, polished it, transformed it, and presented it to the world as if he had never existed. Caspian's throat tightened, and he realized for the first time that this wasn't just fashion. This was a message. His factories, his patents, his so-called genius, it was being displayed not for applause, but as evidence. His theft laid bare, his empire's hubris made visible. The crowd clapped, small at first, then swelling into an approving crescendo that grated against him, each sound a tiny hammer striking the coffin of his ego. Sia's voice, barely audible over the rising applause, trembled. Caspian, those sketches, He turned sharply toward her, the glare slicing the air. "Stay still," he said, though his voice was thin, unconvincing, shaking just slightly despite the attempt at control. His eyes returned to the runway. Another model appeared, wearing a gown that made the previous one look amateurish, and he realized the scale of what had been orchestrated. Whoever was behind this didn't just steal his designs, they perfected them. They elevated them, and now he had no power to stop it. His palms itched, trembling as they pressed against the armrests. His chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. The sensation of losing control, of being publicly outmaneuvered, was suffocating. The announcer's voice cut through the tension, crisp, booming, almost ceremonial. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caspian straightened, bracing, expecting an introduction to some minor sponsor or a routine remark, but the words that followed froze him where he sat. "Please welcome the woman who bought the vain legacy back from the shadows." Caspian's stomach dropped. His pulse hammered in his ears. His fingers, gripping the velvet, were suddenly wet with sweat. Sia gasped, eyes wide, lips parted, a sound barely carried over the soft music still playing. Caspian turned his head, scanning the runway for a trick, for someone else, anyone. But there was no one. The lights shifted subtly, highlighting the models, the designs, and the unmistakable emblem embroidered into each gown. The Vance crest, the woman, his ex-wife. She was coming. and he had not been given a moment to prepare, to threaten, to intervene. The front row that had once signaled his supremacy now felt like the edge of a cliff, and he teetered on it without realizing he had been pushed. A sudden murmur spread through the crowd, a low ripple of excitement and speculation that only made Caspian's pulse spike further. Cameras swiveled, flashes ignited, and the models continued their deliberate procession, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the man whose pride had been stripped in the room's front row. He tried to stand again, to shout, to confront the orchestra of destruction being played in silk and gold, but the two men returned, one hand lightly but firmly pressing his shoulder down. Caspian froze mid-motion, jaw tight, eyes narrowing. Sia leaned closer, whispering, This can't be real." He didn't respond, only watched, feeling the tension coil tighter, the audience's gaze like a lens burning into his confidence. Each step of each model across the runway was a beat in the rhythm of his humiliation. Each camera click was a punctuation to the story being told without his consent. Then another subtle signal. The lights dimmed just a fraction, focusing attention down the center runway. Caspian's stomach churned as he realized the pattern. This was no ordinary show. It was choreography designed to crush him publicly, to display every design he had once hoarded in secret, now elevated, perfected, and claimed by someone who had waited years for this moment. Sia's hand found his arm, tentative, uncertain, but he did not respond. His breathing hitched, chest rising and falling unevenly. His fingers tightened again around the armrest, leather biting his skin. Somewhere in the crowd, a single camera clicked in slow motion, focusing on him alone as the first whisper of recognition crossed lips. That's Caspian Thorne. And the sound was not reverent. It was judgmental, tinged with disbelief. The music shifted slightly, a new model gliding forward, and for a fleeting second, Caspian imagined calling for the show to stop, imagined storming the runway and taking control, imagined undoing the humiliation. But he did not. He could not. Each second, the designs paraded past him. His brain cataloged every seam, every thread, every fold he had once controlled, now transformed into an accusation. The sweat sliding down his temple burned. His throat was dry, voice lodged, fingers trembling faintly around the armrest. He leaned forward slightly, squinting at the runway, and the announcer's voice cut through again, commanding, formal, ceremonial. "Please welcome the woman who bought the vain legacy back from the shadows." And the room seemed to hold its breath. Caspian's heart skipped. Sia's hand went to her mouth. The show was no longer a fashion display, it was an execution, and he was the condemned. The first movement of what would become a meticulously orchestrated downfall had begun, and there was no pause, no escape, only the rising crescendo of realization. His life, his empire, his so-called genius was now on display for everyone to judge. The moment the curtains began to shift, the low hum of anticipation in the Grand Palais seemed to vanish, replaced by a silence so sharp it felt like it sliced through the air. Caspian's pulse slammed against his ribs, a sudden desperate rhythm that betrayed the calm mask he had been trying to wear. He leaned forward, gripping the velvet armrest so tightly the leather creaked, the metal of his cufflinks pressing into his skin. The stage was empty for a breathless heartbeat, and then she appeared. Vesper. 7 months pregnant, her presence commanding every eye without even trying. The dress she wore, liquid silver they called it, moved like water, flowing and catching every flash of the cameras in the room. It was radiant, reflective, almost alive. And Caspian felt a jolt in his chest as the realization hit him. This wasn't the woman he had tried to bury in legal battles. This wasn't the fragile figure he had dismissed as powerless. This was an embodiment of ownership, of control, and she was walking straight into the epicenter of his humiliation. Sia stiffened beside him. the diamonds on her neck suddenly looking garish, cheap, almost comical under the gleaming stage lights. She pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes wide, realizing in slow, creeping horror that she wasn't the spectacle. She wasn't the goddess of this moment. She was a placeholder for a ghost she had never known. Caspian's eyes burned, tracking every step of Vesper's slow, powerful stride. He wanted to stand, to shout, to somehow halt this procession, but his body betrayed him. Refusing action as though it understood a futility he was only beginning to grasp. The models behind her followed, but they were no longer the center of attention. Every flash, every gaze, every whispered comment in the room was drawn like iron filings to a magnet toward the pregnant woman striding forward with such assurance it made his own front-row throne feel hollow, worthless. Vesper's eyes met his, steady, unwavering, and Caspian felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It wasn't anger she projected, it was clarity, a precision of intent that cut deeper than fury. She wasn't here to seduce or to tease. She wasn't here to plead or to bargain. She was here to reclaim, to execute the reckoning of years of theft and arrogance. Every step she took was measured, deliberate, a visual proof of strategy realized, of patience perfected. The metallic sheen of her gown reflected the camera's flashes, each spark a reminder of everything Caspian had thought he owned and now no longer controlled. He swallowed hard, the sound wet in his own ears, as the audience collectively leaned in, the weight of their attention pressing down on him like the ceiling itself had descended. Every eye was on her, every whisper carried judgment, and somewhere behind the velvet ropes, the first murmurs of recognition spread like wildfire. That's Vesper. She's back. She's owning this. Sia's hand shook slightly against Caspian's arm, and he could feel her disbelief radiating, the tiny tremor of someone realizing they were on the wrong side of history. She tried to meet his gaze, seeking some anchor, some reassurance, but he had none to give. His voice lodged in his throat, his body frozen. As though the realization that everything he had spent years building was being stripped away in real time had arrested him completely. He could hear the soft clicking of cameras, the scraping of heels against polished marble, the collective inhale of hundreds of fashion insiders realizing the full scope of the revelation. And yet even amid this storm, Vesper moved with absolute control, her hand resting lightly against the curve of her belly, a subtle, almost imperceptible signal that this was not just a reclamation of a company, not just revenge. It was the birth of a legacy, a power that had multiplied in the silence of his ignorance. Caspian tried to speak. "Stop this," he hissed, words tight, guttural, a snap of authority that had once bent entire boards to his will. But no one moved. Two men flanking him pressed subtly against his shoulders again, reminders that physical power could not overcome orchestration, that wealth alone was meaningless when the tide of strategy had shifted against him. He leaned forward, jaw tight, eyes narrowing as he searched for a flaw, a crack, something he could exploit, but there was none. Vesper's rhythm was flawless, unbroken, each step punctuated by the weight of certainty. The music shifted in subtle layers, accentuating her walk, weaving tension into every beat, every seam, every glint of metallic thread. It was cinematic, terrifying in its precision, and Caspian could only sit, powerless, as the woman he had tried to control turned the stage into an indictment of him and everything he had assumed belonged to him. Sia's whisper was almost inaudible. It's her designs, isn't it? She's using them." Caspian's hands clenched the armrests so tightly his nails bit into the leather. "Yes," he ground out, voice low, dangerous, but hollow. "Yes, she's using them." The thought that someone had taken his property and transformed it into a weapon pointed directly at him made his stomach churn. Each model behind Vesper, each reflective stitch, each fluid fold of fabric was proof that control was an illusion, that dominance depended on others' compliance, and that he had already lost without realizing it. He glanced at the crowd, looking for loyalty, for an ally, for a shred of reverence, and found only fascination, curiosity, admiration for Vesper, and subtle amusement at his disorientation. The applause rose in measured bursts, not for him, not for Sia, but for the pregnant woman who had become the epicenter of the room, the axis around which this entire narrative spun. Vesper reached the runway's edge, her steps slowing, deliberate, a quiet announcement of authority without a single word. Cameras zoomed in, the flashes igniting against the metallic sheen of her gown, and Caspian felt a contraction of fear, a tightening of his chest that made breathing slightly more difficult. The room had transformed. What had been an event celebrating fashion had become a courtroom, a tribunal where he was the sole defendant, and every stitch, every reflective panel, every shimmer of liquid silver acted as both evidence and sentence. Sia turned her face toward him, eyes wide, whispering in disbelief. She's glowing. But Caspian could only focus on the woman who now held the room in her hand, whose pregnant belly was as much a statement as the clothes she wore, a tangible symbol of continuity, of growth, of a future he could no longer claim. Every shutter click punctuated the fall of his reign. Every camera zoom captured his disbelief, his desperation, his unraveling. Then the silence broke as Vesper leaned slightly into her lapel mic, voice soft but cutting through the hall like a scalpel. "I hope you enjoyed the front row seat to your own bankruptcy." The words struck Caspian before he could process them. Sia gasped audibly beside him, her diamonds reflecting light in frantic, flickering patterns. The audience leaned forward instinctively, collective jaws tightening, eyes widening at the utter coldness and precision of the moment. Caspian's throat went dry. His pulse hammered like a drum, but he could not move. He was trapped in place, watching as his ex-wife turned the stage into both spectacle and execution. The music swelled slightly, the models gliding past, the metallic threads of the gowns catching every flash, every eye, amplifying the humiliation, and Caspian realized in a shiver that nothing he had done, no fortune, no influence, no charm or intimidation, could undo the narrative being written in real time. He had become a spectator to his own undoing. The subtle murmurs across the hall rippled again, soft gasps, whispers of astonishment, a collective recognition that something monumental was happening before their eyes. Caspian tried again to shout, to interrupt, to wrest control, but the two men beside him reminded him physically what his wealth could not: restraint. The lights caught on Vesper's bracelets, the curve of her gown, the swell of her belly, and for a moment, even Sia seemed to shrink under the weight of it all, realizing she had been nothing more than a prop in someone else's story. Caspian's lips pressed together, jaw tight, eyes burning as the realization deepened. The room had shifted, power had shifted, and every footstep Vesper took toward him was another nail in the coffin of his dominance. She stopped just at the edge of the runway, gaze locked, measured, unyielding, and for the first time, Caspian understood. This was no fashion show. This was a reckoning, and he had no defense. Caspian's chest was still pounding from Vesper's words, the sting of humiliation raw in his ears as the runway lights reflected off her liquid silver gown like a mirror mocking him. The room had gone unnervingly quiet, the soft murmur of cameras and whispered speculation suspended in anticipation. And then she spoke again, slowly, deliberately, turning the attention outward from herself, directing it into a weapon. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice clear and calm, "tonight is not just a fashion show. Tonight is a demonstration of accountability. Caspian's jaw tightened. His breath caught. He leaned forward, trying to process the calm authority in her tone, the precision in her words. Realizing that nothing he had done, no charm, no wealth, no intimidation could intercept the narrative she was now constructing. The audience, once curious and admiring, now leaned in collectively, sensing the shift, feeling the suspense, wondering what had been concealed all these years and what would finally be revealed. Vesper lifted her hand, and the massive screens above the runway flickered to life, illuminating the hall with crisp, white light. A digital contract appeared, precise and unyielding, each line typed with unassailable clarity. Caspian's eyes widened as the words scrolled. She hadn't just bought the venue, she had acquired the debt of his entire empire. Every factory, every brand, every asset he had once flaunted like trophies was now tethered to her authority. The room seemed to tilt, reality bending in a way only panic can bend it. He wanted to speak, to shout, to call for some correction, but his voice lodged, swallowed by the weight of inevitability. Sia shifted beside him, but Caspian barely noticed her trembling hand now clutching her gown, the diamonds flashing feebly in comparison to the bright, unyielding power cascading across the screens. The murmurs of the audience grew, a soft wave building into recognition, understanding, awe, and a hint of schadenfreude. Caspian's hands gripped the velvet armrests, nails biting into the leather as he realized he had been orchestrated, played, outmaneuvered, and utterly exposed. Then Vesper's gaze swept the front row, precise and deliberate, landing on him like a scalpel tracing the outline of his pride. "While some of us were distracted by appearances," she said, voice level and cutting, "others were hard at work ensuring accountability." She gestured toward the digital screens. Charts, financial summaries, and emails appeared in quick succession. Evidence of Caspian's negligence, his mismanagement, his greed. Each slide struck him harder than the last, a tangible reminder that all the years of confidence, of wealth, of power had been nothing more than a mirage. Caspian's mouth opened and closed, no words forming. Sia's pale face shifted toward him, a question forming in her wide eyes, and he wanted to warn her, to explain, to stop the collapse. But the room had become a stage for judgment, and he had no lines left to speak. The screens flickered again, revealing something more damning. Messages, photos, and documents proving that Sia, the jewel-strewn, laughing girl at his side, was not his ally, nor his conquest, nor his muse. She had been working for Vesper all along, a paid informant sent to observe, report, and mislead him while he flaunted power, wealth, and indulgence. Caspian's eyes snapped to her, horror washing over his face, searching for any sign of loyalty, any flicker of guilt, any hesitation. But there was none. Sia's attention was absorbed entirely by her phone, tapping, scrolling, confirming her own payout, indifferent to the man she had been sent to destroy. The humiliation struck Caspian as a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, and he leaned back in disbelief. The whispers in the room escalated. "Did he know?" someone murmured. "How long?" another asked. Caspian's mind raced. How long had she been playing him? How much had he thought he controlled, only to find out he had been the fool? Vesper's eyes never wavered from him. She stepped closer to the edge of the runway, the metallic threads of her gown catching every flash, highlighting the curve of her belly, the unyielding confidence in her posture. She didn't raise her voice, didn't scream, didn't need to. Each movement was calculated, precise, a reminder that power and control could be expressed without words, without threats, without melodrama. Caspian's pulse thrummed in his temples as the room absorbed the evidence, the narrative, the message. He was no longer the puppeteer. He had been reduced to the audience, helpless, watching as the woman he had underestimated orchestrated the dismantling of everything he had claimed. Sia's face went pale beneath her glittering makeup, realizing that she had been a pawn, an expendable piece in a larger game she had only partially understood. Vesper held up one hand, not in a gesture of triumph, but of inevitability, and addressed the crowd again, calm, precise, measured. Ladies and gentlemen, what you are witnessing is not just a takeover of assets, it is a demonstration of foresight, strategy, and accountability. While some were busy indulging in temporary pleasures, we ensured that history would remember who built and who destroyed. This isn't about revenge, it's about legacy. Caspian could barely breathe. Each word was a knife twisting in his chest. The murmurs in the room grew louder, people turning toward their neighbors, nodding in agreement, a collective understanding that this was a public dismantling of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. The velvet ropes that had once symbolized exclusivity now felt like a cage around him, enclosing him in a spotlight of shame and exposure. He attempted to speak again. "Sia, what is this?" But the words fell flat. The two men flanking him pressed gently but firmly against his shoulders, a reminder of his impotence. Sia looked up briefly, a half smile of faint triumph crossing her lips before returning to her phone. Caspian's eyes darted around, searching for support, for someone, anyone to step in, to stop this cascade of humiliation. But the audience was fully captive of Vesper's display. She had taken every thread, every document, every legal loophole he had relied upon, and woven them into a performance designed to strip him bare before the world. The music swelled slightly, orchestrated to accompany her words and presence, reinforcing her dominance, reinforcing his defeat. He swallowed hard, chest tight, throat dry, realizing fully that this was a public execution, not with bullets or fists, but with strategy, patience, and brilliance. And then, with a deliberate lean forward, Vesper's voice cut through the orchestration, soft but lethal, intended only for him. "The baby isn't the only thing that's been growing while you were playing house, Caspian." Her gaze, steady, unwavering and piercing, locked on his, forcing him to absorb the weight of the words. Every eye in the room turned subtly toward him as the phrase sank in, but they did not need clarification. The sentence hung, perfect, complete, lethal. Caspian's chest tightened further, sweat prickling along his temples, his fingers digging into the armrest as the words echoed in his mind. Sia's phone fell momentarily in her lap as her eyes widened. Caspian's legs threatened to give way beneath him, and he realized that the world he had thought he ruled, the narrative he had tried to control, had slipped entirely from his grasp. Every whisper, every camera click, every murmured realization in the room compounded the intensity of the moment. The audience sat spellbound, and in that instant Caspian knew with crushing certainty he was finished. And yet the show was only beginning. Caspian's chest heaved as Vesper's words sank into him, the sting of realization too heavy, too sharp to process fully. He felt as if the room had tilted, the audience's collective attention pressing down on him like a physical weight, and the music, which had been orchestrated to accompany her presence, suddenly became irrelevant, background noise to the storm in his mind. "No!" he roared, voice cracking, a jagged sound that echoed through the hall and ricocheted off the high ceilings. The baby is mine!" His hands shot out instinctively, grasping the air as if pulling back reality itself would restore control. "I have rights. I have paternal rights." The words sounded hollow, desperate, and yet he clung to them, imagining that legality could anchor him when every other support had been stripped away. The audience froze, a ripple of confusion sweeping through the crowd, watching the billionaire unravel in real time, his empire's front row now a stage for a meltdown. Cameras clicked frantically, capturing the tremor in his hands, the flush in his cheeks, the madness in his eyes, broadcasting his desperation to the world without mercy. Sia flinched beside him, her hand hovering over her phone, as if uncertain whether to shield her eyes or continue collecting the proof of her own reward. Caspian's glare swung to her briefly, sharp, accusing, searching for an ally in a sea of betrayal, but she did not meet his gaze. Her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes averted, absorbed in her device. He realized in that instant that the woman he had flaunted, spent millions on, and paraded as his symbol of power had always been a calculation, a tool, a mirror for Vesper's strategy. Rage and disbelief coiled in him simultaneously, tightening his chest, twisting his stomach, making his pulse pound in a frantic rhythm. Every beat was a reminder. His world was crumbling, and he had been blind to the orchestration unfolding before him for years. Vesper's movements were calm, almost ritualistic, her hands brushing lightly against her belly as she activated the screen with a single gesture. The music stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like the hall itself was holding its breath. Caspian's voice rang out against the quiet, an unsteady scream. "The baby is mine. I am the father. You—" He choked on the words, swallowing hard, his ego flailing, clawing at the edge of rationality. The two men beside him leaned in subtly, restraining without force, reinforcing the stark reality. He was powerless here, now, in front of hundreds of influential eyes, every one of them witnessing his unraveling. Vesper's gaze, unwavering and calm, cut through his chaos like a scalpel, precise, unflinching, and her next move was methodical in a way that made his blood run cold. The screen lit up with a single document, its clarity almost cruel in the sterile, fluorescent glow of the digital display. A medical file, official and signed. Caspian's eyes narrowed as he read the words slowly, disbelief tangling with fear. Vasectomy. Dated 5 years ago, verified by his own doctor's signature. The sound of it, both visual and conceptual, struck him harder than any physical blow could. His knees felt weak, his chest constricted. His mind spun, trying to reconcile the claim he had shouted with the irrefutable proof now glaring at him. He had lied to himself for years, convinced of his virility, his power, his legacy, and now it all collapsed under a cold, undeniable truth. He had been sterile. His claim to paternity, his sense of control over Vesper, the imagined line of succession to his empire, all were illusions built on the fragile foundation of his ego. The room held its breath, the audience leaning in instinctively, aware that they were witnessing the complete dismantling of a man who had once commanded entire industries. Saya's lips parted slightly, a whisper of comprehension escaping her, but she kept her gaze fixed downward. Caspian's glare snapped to her, desperate, incredulous, but she did not look back. His hands clenched the armrests again, nails biting into the leather, the knuckles white as his panic mounted. How could he have been so blind? How could he have been so consumed with appearances, with flaunting diamonds, with the illusion of power, that he never anticipated the meticulous patience of his adversary? Vesper's calm stood in stark contrast to his chaos, her every movement deliberate, measured, unflinching, a testament to the strategy he had failed to perceive. The audience murmured, some leaning forward, some gasping, others whispering questions that Caspian couldn't hear fully over the pounding in his head. Was it always like this? Someone asked. Was he truly deceived? Or did he know? The tension was palpable, the suspense hanging like a tangible curtain between his former authority and the new reality being unveiled. Vesper's voice finally cut through, steady, deliberate, as though she were narrating a lesson in absolute control. You were deceived, Caspian. Not by me, not by anyone else, by yourself, by the story you told yourself to feel powerful. The words sank into him like ice water, each syllable a blow against the fragile constructs of his ego. He tried to respond, to shout, to argue, but the voice lodged in his throat, swallowed by the magnitude of the evidence, the spectacle, and the calm dominance of the woman before him. Cameras captured every twitch, every tremor of disbelief in his face, broadcasting the spectacle of a man who had thought himself untouchable, now exposed, vulnerable, and broken. The murmurs of the crowd intensified, whispers spreading. He's been outmaneuvered, completely. Look at him. He doesn't even realize how powerless he is. Then the subtle, almost ceremonial pause. Vesper leaned slightly closer to the screen, finger tracing the document, emphasizing the inevitability of her revelation. And for the first time, the audience realized the full depth of her orchestration. Caspian's hands shook, eyes wide, pulse thrumming in his temples, chest rising and falling rapidly, as if each breath had to negotiate the weight of his humiliation. He had tried to control, to dominate, to manipulate, yet here he sat, a man stripped of every assumption of superiority, exposed to hundreds of cameras, flashing lights, and public scrutiny. The crowd absorbed it all, leaning forward, whispering in disbelief, some audibly laughing softly at the audacity and perfection of the dismantling, as Caspian's world fractured before him in real time. Sia glanced briefly up, eyes wide, and he realized fully that she'd been complicit in the plan, that her presence, her indulgence, her glittering facade had all been components of a careful trap. Panic and fury collided in him, the room spinning with the weight of reality. Finally, a reporter's voice rang out, cutting sharply through the tension, unmistakable, public, and brutal. If you're not the father, then who is the man behind the new Vance empire? The question echoed through the hall, bouncing off the polished marble floors, ricocheting against the ceiling, amplifying Caspian's panic in 1,000 subtle echoes. Every camera captured the flash of shock, disbelief, and rising horror in his expression. Every whisper, every side-eye from the audience amplified the moment. Caspian's chest constricted, pulse hammering as he struggled to grasp the implications. His ego had been shattered, his control stripped, his paternity claim disproven. And now the world demanded to know the identity of the man who had succeeded where he had failed. Sia's phone slid slightly from her hand, unnoticed, as she observed the unfolding spectacle. Caspian's mind raced frantically, searching for a thread of control, a loophole, a way to reclaim anything. But the trap had been perfectly set, and he had walked willingly into every detail, every step, every calculated move, orchestrated with a precision he could no longer counter. The audience sat on the edge of their seats, breath collectively held, waiting for the next revelation, the next strike, the next unraveling of the man who had thought himself invincible. Caspian's mind was spinning, a chaotic storm of disbelief, rage, and shame. He had just been stripped of his ego, his power, his claim to legacy. And now the silence that followed the reporter's sharp question hung over him like a noose. Every eye in the Grand Palais was still fixed on him, watching, waiting, anticipating his next move, or his collapse. The air was thick, electric, heavy with tension, the faint smell of perfume and polished wood mixing with the metallic tang of panic in his own blood. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, a figure emerged from the shadows of the VIP lounge, tall, composed, and deliberate in his movements. Julian. Caspian froze mid-breath, the name a sudden, bitter echo in his mind. His younger brother, the one he had framed, imprisoned, and erased from the family history, now walking with a confidence that radiated as much power as Vesper herself. The shock hit Caspian like a physical punch to the gut, and his knees threatened to buckle. He had expected vengeance, anger, fury, but Julian's expression was unreadable, calm, indifferent. That indifference cut deeper than any rage could have, a reminder that humiliation could be more potent than physical violence. It wasn't hatred he felt from Julian, it was a quiet, lethal detachment, a reminder that the power he once wielded was no longer his to command. Saya stiffened beside him, diamonds glittering uselessly under the lights. Her eyes widened as she realized that the man who had been missing from the narrative, the brother Caspian, had thought he controlled through absence and legal manipulation, was now fully present, aligned with Vesper, and fully aware of the consequences awaiting Caspian. She moved slightly, as if to intervene, but Caspian's glare cut her down immediately. Julian's steps were silent. Yet every footfall carried the weight of inevitability, of plans long nurtured, of strategy perfected over years behind bars. He paused at the edge of the lounge, eyes flicking once over the audience, then settling squarely on Caspian. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the soft click of high heels and the faint hum of the remaining orchestral music. The audience leaned in, sensing something monumental about to unfold, and Caspian's stomach twisted in dread, his palms slick with sweat as he tried to find a foothold in a collapsing reality. "You," Caspian rasped, voice trembling with disbelief and rage. "You're... how... why..." His words caught in his throat. The anger, the betrayal, the years of supposed control unraveling into a raw, exposed nerve. Julian did not respond immediately. He did not shout, did not defend, did not gloat. He simply stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his gaze neutral, the faintest shadow of a smirk barely noticeable at the corner of his mouth. "I've been waiting," Julian said finally, voice low, almost conversational, and the calmness of it sent another shiver through Caspian's spine. "Waiting for the right moment, waiting for the opportunity to fix what you broke, waiting for the day someone else would take control while you were too busy playing king." The words were measured, precise, and stung worse than any accusation because they were true. Caspian's throat went dry, his pulse hammering as he processed the cold, brutal reality that the brother he had tried to destroy was now the instrument of his complete undoing. His mind scrambled for a response, a defense, a line of attack, but there was none. He had been outmaneuvered in every conceivable way. The room shifted subtly, the attention of the audience now splitting between Vesper, the pregnant, commanding figure who had dismantled his empire, and Julian, who had emerged from obscurity with the weight of calculated inevitability. Caspian's breath came in short, ragged gasps. You can't do this," he stammered, each word a desperate grasp for control that wasn't there. This is my... His sentence faltered, collapsing under the immovable force of strategy and patience that Julian embodied. Vesper, ever calm, glanced at Julian and then back at Caspian, her eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "It's over, Caspian," she said softly but pointedly, voice carrying the authority of someone who has already won. The audience murmured again, sensing the magnitude of what was unfolding. Understanding fully that this was not just a corporate takeover, not just a personal reckoning, it was a complete rewriting of the power structure, with Caspian as the only one left exposed, naked before both family and the world. Sia's lips parted slightly, a breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward instinctively, a small, futile hope in her eyes that maybe Julian, the brother she had once admired in the shadows, might offer her protection, a lifeline. But Julian's gaze passed over her like she was air, completely indifferent to her existence. Security moved in almost automatically, guiding her back with gentle but firm hands. Caspian's eyes followed her, a mixture of disbelief and betrayal in his expression. She had been used, like he had, yet differently, aligned with the new order rather than the old. Julian's indifference toward her only magnified Caspian's sense of isolation. emphasizing the stark reality that alliances were gone, loyalties had shifted, and the empire he had built on control and fear had evaporated completely. Julian took another deliberate step forward, closing the distance between him and Caspian, every movement measured, every footfall precise. Caspian's breathing grew heavier, pulse thrumming like a drum in his ears, as he realized fully the extent of his downfall. He had been played, outmaneuvered, and every gesture from Vesper and Julian was designed to maximize both psychological and public impact. The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing that something more was coming, that the final humiliation had yet to be delivered. Caspian swallowed hard, trying to muster defiance, but his throat was dry. His mind reeling, his body trembling under the weight of exposure. Julian's expression remained stoic, indifferent, calm, an unyielding wall that Caspian could not break, could not circumvent. It was not rage he faced, it was certainty, and certainty was far more terrifying. Finally, Julian reached into his pocket and drew something small, holding it out deliberately so Caspian could see. A single euro coin, dull in the spotlight, utterly symbolic, yet its significance struck Caspian with the force of revelation. His eyebrows shot up, disbelief mingling with a sharp, almost painful recognition. Julian's voice, calm, unhurried, carried across the tense hall. "That's all that's left of your inheritance. Spend it wisely." The words, simple and devoid of emotion, struck Caspian like lightning, a final, undeniable confirmation that everything he had believed, every asset, every claim, every illusion of control, had been stripped from him. The audience absorbed it instantly, murmurs and gasps rippling through the hall, their collective realization enhancing the sting of humiliation. Caspian's pulse thundered in his ears, his jaw tight, eyes wide, as he realized the extent of his isolation, the precision of the orchestration, and the complete success of the coup against him. Sia was gone. Julian was indifferent. Vesper was unshakable, and he had nothing. The tension in the Grand Palais had reached a fever pitch, a suffocating electric charge that seemed to make the chandeliers tremble in their crystal sockets. Caspian's heart pounded in his chest like a drumbeat of doom. He could feel it in his ears, throbbing in rhythm with the murmur of the crowd, each whisper, each gasp, each barely suppressed camera click magnifying the collapse of his world. The music had resumed briefly, a soft undercurrent meant to accompany the spectacle, but to him it sounded hollow, like a soundtrack to a life being erased. And then, at the back of the hall, a subtle shuffle of feet, the quiet click of polished shoes against marble, signaled the arrival of the police. Caspian's pulse spiked, adrenaline and fear colliding as he realized that the final act had begun. They waited patiently, waiting for the right moment to claim him, their presence like a shadow stretching across every inch of the hall. Every eye on him, every camera trained, every whisper in the audience. He was trapped in a perfect storm of exposure, humiliation, and impending arrest. Vesper and Julian appeared together on the runway, radiant in a way that made the lights themselves pale in comparison. She, glowing, 7 months pregnant, moving with the calm certainty of a woman reclaiming her empire. He composed and commanding, every gesture precise, every step measured. The audience erupted, a thunderous, sustained ovation that made Caspian flinch. Their cheers were not just applause, they were recognition, validation, the world acknowledging the shift of power that had been years in the making. Caspian's mouth went dry, eyes scanning the hall, trying in vain to find a lifeline, a clue, a crack in the armor of their dominance. There was none. Every camera angle, every flash, every murmur of admiration reinforced the truth. He was finished. His empire, his name, his legacy, erased, rewritten, replaced by Vesper and Julian. The front row seat he had coveted, The authority he had flaunted, the control he had assumed, was now nothing more than a memory, slipping through his fingers like fine sand. He tried to speak, to shout, to assert himself, but his voice lodged somewhere between his throat and his panic. This isn't... You can't... His words caught as Julian's indifferent gaze met his, unyielding, cold, devoid of the slightest spark of compassion or anger. Julian did not speak, did not flinch, did not react. His calmness, his control, his presence was more devastating than any outburst could have been. Caspian's hands clenched the velvet armrests, knuckles white, as he realized fully the emptiness of his situation. Security men moved in subtly, no aggression, only precision, guiding him to rise, to walk, to be led from the hall that had been his stage, his kingdom, his arena of control. He was a man unmade in front of the world, and the spectacle of his unraveling was being recorded, photographed, and whispered about in real time by the most influential eyes in fashion, media, and society. The kitchen exit loomed ahead, the path from luxury and glamour to the harsh, cold reality of the Parisian night. Caspian's steps were unsteady, each one a painful reminder of how thoroughly he had been stripped of power. The night air hit him as he emerged, sharp, damp, and unforgiving, the cold biting into his skin and searing through the layers of arrogance he had built around himself for decades. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement, mirroring the tears that he refused to shed, but which threatened to surface anyway, stinging his eyes. Across the glass doors of the Grand Palais, Vesper remained, standing tall, hand resting gently on her stomach, radiant in her calm authority. Every flash from the press cameras reflected off her gown, her presence, her unmistakable claim to power. Caspian's chest constricted. That hand on her belly was more than a symbol of life. It was a declaration of a future from which he was irrevocably excluded. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than any debt, sharper than any legal judgment. He had watched empires rise and fall, but now he was witnessing one that would rise while he crumbled, orchestrated perfectly by the woman he had underestimated. The marquee above the Grand Palais changed, smooth, unrelenting, replacing his name with Vance Global. Caspian froze, every muscle rigid, as the weight of symbolism hit him fully. The empire that he had fought to dominate, the legacy he had imagined immortal, was now entirely under someone else's control. Vesper's calm dominance, Julian's silent, calculated presence, the precise orchestration of each event, each revelation, each public humiliation. It was an execution of power without a single misstep, and he had been helpless to stop it. He pressed his face against the glass briefly, hoping, praying, for some glimpse of weakness, some hesitation that might let him reclaim even a fragment of control. But there was none. She was absolute, radiant, untouchable, and entirely unbothered by his downfall. And the audience, the cameras, the world beyond the Grand Palais would remember this moment forever. The police led him to the waiting car, doors opening silently, the quiet efficiency of their movements a stark contrast to the chaos roiling inside him. He glanced once more at the building, at the lights, at the press, at the new rulers of a world he thought he owned, and felt the last threads of his empire slip away like smoke through his fingers. The driver's door closed, the siren soft in the distance, and the car began to roll through the wet Paris streets. Rain-slicked pavement reflected the city lights in fractured, distorted shapes, like shards of Caspian's shattered ego. And then, through the rain-streaked window, he saw it. A billboard illuminated boldly against the night sky, Vesper's image commanding, pregnant, triumphant, and beside her the words, almost taunting, almost poetic. The future belongs to those who survive the past. Caspian's fingers curled around the seat edge, knuckles digging into leather, chest tight, pulse racing. The words burned into him, a stark reminder that no empire, no wealth, no deceit, no power could withstand patience, strategy, and resolve when wielded by someone who had outlasted you. He pressed his forehead to the glass, staring, heart hammering, watching Vesper and Julian walk together on the runway one last time, the true king and queen of the industry, while his own reflection stared back at him in the rainy glass, distorted, broken, and empty. A single thought anchored itself in his mind, bitter, cold, and undeniable. He had been beaten, outplayed, and the throne he had imagined as his was gone, forever. And yet, somewhere deep in that storm of humiliation and despair, a faint, almost imperceptible understanding emerged. Power was not just about wealth or control. It was about endurance, patience, and knowing when to strike. Vesper had survived, and in doing so, she had rewritten the rules entirely. The car disappeared into the night, lights reflecting off the slick streets, leaving behind the glowing, eternal reminder above the Grand Palais that the future belonged to those who endured, those who planned, and those who never underestimated the power of strategy. Caspian sat in silence, the cold rain washing over the car as he realized fully, with a sinking final weight, that his era was over, and the city, indifferent yet perfectly attuned to the drama, carried on around him. And that's the story of Caspian Thorne, a man who thought power was his birthright, only to be outplayed by patience, strategy, and the strength of a woman who refused to be underestimated. If this twist of betrayal, revenge, and ultimate triumph hit you as hard as it hit him, imagine what the next story could do. Don't miss out. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for more stories that pull you right into the drama, the heartbreak, and the victories you'll never forget. After all, the future belongs to those who survive the past.